parts of research methodology. As a part of academia, all of us have been focusing constantly on research and research work. We are in constant endeavor to publish quality research work, and robustness in research is something that all of us are looking forward to. Let us now take this journey forward and understand, why do we need research? What is research, first of all? Research is simply knowledge. It is search for knowledge. It is also a scientific and systematic search for pertinent information on a specific topic. Research is thus something that is an original contribution to already existing stock of knowledge, making for its advancement. So something that is already existing, you cannot present an already existing part of knowledge. You have to come up with something new in a very different form. Only then you add a stock to the knowledge. Coming to today's topic, when we all do research and research methodology, having a proper research design is the first and foremost important part of our research. Whether we are doing a research proposal, or we are writing a research project, or we are doing it for our research paper, research design forms one of the most important parts of our research. Now, I will just share a very small presentation. I would like to make it more of an interactive session, to have it more of a conversation. Hope the screen is visible to everyone.
Yes, it is.
All right, thank you, ma'am. So we're talking about sampling techniques. With this, we first talk about research design, beginning with research design. What is research design? It's the blueprint for the research work that we are going to do. The kind of data collection that we are going to do, the kind of measurement, the kind of analysis, what ways in which we are going to collect the data, what ways in which we are going to analyze data, what are the ways in which we are going to measure the data. Everything related to the data, the research, is part of research design. This is actually an outline of what a researcher does or a researcher will perform in their whole journey of research. This is an arrangement of conditions for collection, analysis, measurement, everything that one pertains to do in their journey to pursue research in their outcome for the data. We in social sciences and management generally focus on sampling design and statistical design for research. There are other observational designs and so on, but here we generally focus on sampling and statistical designs. Let us understand the features of a good design, which will similarly make you, it will help you to understand also the features of a very good sample, because these are the features of not only a good design, research design, but also features of a very good sample design. A good research design should be flexible. Now, we generally deal with three different kinds of research design, in the sense, one is exploratory research design, second is descriptive research design, and the third is causative research design, which is also experimental research design. The kind of research design which is good for an exploratory research design is flexible. It should be flexible enough to incorporate everything that you want for an exploratory research. because an exploratory research is something that is very new and wants to explore new ideas. It is something that is not already established as a fact, but you want to establish it, or you want to come up with a new idea or ideology, and thereby you try to test that hypothesis. So when you try to test that, you try to come up with new ideologies, and you have to be flexible enough to incorporate new concepts and new ideologies. So your research design should be flexible enough to incorporate all the new concepts, new ideologies, new experiences, and thereby experiences kind of ideologies are very important for such kind of research designs, where exploratory design is important when you're conducting an exploratory research design. When we try to do a descriptive research design, we have to be very appropriate about the research design, in the sense that the kind of data that has to be collected, we will see that when we come precisely to sampling design as well, that the amount of data that has to be collected has to be of a very significant size and of very robust. It has to be extremely robust in nature, because the descriptive research design deals with questions of deals with questions of when, how, and so on. So when you try to describe a certain idea, when you try to describe a certain population, you need to have certain features. And in order to have the details of that particular those particular features of that population, you need to have maximum amount of sample, and the sample has to be extremely robust in nature in order to be unbiased, and also to have an appropriate sample to give you the perfect and robust outcome for a descriptive kind of a research design or descriptive kind of a study. Then another feature of good research design is that it should be efficient enough. It should be economical, which we will deal with, because you cannot go beyond your budget when you're designing your research. The last kind of research design, that's the third kind, which we call of experimental as well. The experimental or the causal kind of research design, it started with Fisher, Professor Fisher, and it started with agriculture economics. It started when Professor Fisher started the kind of experiments that we did in agriculture, with one plot being fixed like we still do. And then from agriculture, it started moving on to different areas of economics and so on. And thereby, still we see that in experimental research design, we still use words like yield, plot, and so on. So for that, because we are using controlled, we are using experimental group and controlled group, thereby we try to have the least amount of error in a causal kind of a study. So cause and outcome kind of a relationship study where we are having causality, those are an experimental kind of research design and studies where we try to minimize the error, because if the error is on the higher side, then the experiment is supposed to fail. Also, it is very similar to the natural sciences study, wherein experiments are very common, and we know that in experiments also a research is supposed to be only when it is replicated. So if a research is not or cannot be replicated, it cannot be a good research, or it is not supposed to be, it is not found to be a good research. Thereby, the amount of error is tried to be minimal, and the error part has to be minimized, and especially for the experiment studies. Sampling design. But for sampling design, why not go for the whole population? Why create a sample? First, let us understand. What is a universe? There are steps to create a sample. Now, all items that you want to study for your research work will constitute a universe or a population, all the items that you want to study. But for you as a researcher who has very limited resources, who has very limited time, would it be feasible for you to conduct a study wherein each and every participant of the universe is included in your research? It is practically impossible for any ordinary researcher to conduct a study that would incorporate all the participants of a research or all the participants of your universe or population. And when we do that, that generally happens in a census, which we know that happens every decade. We are still waiting for our census. Generally, the conducting agency for census is government. Also, there are their own pros and cons of having census data and sample data. It involves huge resources, time, effort, and so on. But still, as an ordinary researcher, we do not conduct our study based on census, or we do not conduct our studies where we include each and every part of the population. But there is an exception if we try to focus on a population which is extremely small, then it becomes feasible for us to include each and every part of the population and then use that as part of our research work. In practical studies that we undertake, especially under social sciences, we have a lot of considerations in terms of cost, time, and that lead to a selection of respondents. Selection of respondents not only is because of our constraints of time and cost, but also because of the kind of quality that we can spend on the smaller sample size that we collect for our study. So these respondents, which are selected, they have to be representative of the total population in order to produce, which should be a miniature of a cross section of the whole population. This whole selection process of the respondents is called sampling technique. And the one which we collect, the respondents which we collect from the whole population is called sample. So the survey that we conduct in order to collect the sample is known as sample survey. We have already understood that what is a population? It is a much larger part of our study, our universe. We, through sampling process, we constitute and take out a smaller representative part of the population, which is sample, which is our major part of the study. Now, why it is important? It is important because it represents your whole population. It also, we have to be extremely careful in determining and choosing our sample, because if we go wrong in choosing our sample or the methodology used in choosing our sample, which is called the sampling technique used to choose the sample, is wrong, the accuracy of our result or the outcome of our research goes completely wrong. And that is why the sampling technique is extremely important, and the kind of sample that we select is very, very important. So that is why understanding sampling technique in research is of huge importance. Although we are over here concentrating only on social sciences and management, there are different ways that we have sampling in natural sciences as well. In social sciences, we generally have probability and non-probability sampling techniques on which we are concentrating today. In natural sciences, we have part of the non-probability sampling also. Then we have in management also some part of the social sciences sampling, probability and non-probability sampling that we also use. They also use part of it. So we are broadly categorizing the kind of sampling techniques into probability sampling and non-probability sampling. So if you've studied statistics, while we do probability and non-probability, we know it is through randomization or non-randomization. So although when we come to experiments and when we try to do our research work, it seems very easy for us to collect samples from field and say that we have randomly selected people for our study. It is not true that random selection is easy. Whereas we will find that random selection of samples is the most difficult part of sampling. How? We will look at it. Features of a good sample. This has to be true because it has to be a true representation of a sample. The sampling error coming out of it has to be extremely small. If it goes beyond 5, it says that the kind of sample that has been selected for the study is not accurately representative of the population, or the sampling technique is not correct, or there has been bias in selection of the sample size. In the context of selection of fund, because it has to be viable in terms of fund. As a researcher, you get a very specified amount of funds, especially if you have a funded project, if you have say if you're working on a funded project, if you're working on a research work, if you're working on a PhD proposal, you have your very limited fund. So that is why you will have to be very careful of what funds and how you have to design your research proposal. And based on that, your sampling has to be calculated. The sample also has to be calculated based on the concept that it can be replicated as the result that has come out of it, or the result that comes out of it can be replicated later on. A good research is always considered as a good research when the results that come out of it can be replicated elsewhere. And that is why if you have a biased sample, then the sample may or might give a biased result, and then your outcome might not be accurate or might have more error, and that might result in a biased outcome, which then eventually will not be a good result that can be replicated elsewhere. Thereby, having a robust sample and sampling technique is extremely important, so that after After you come up with a result, it can be replicated elsewhere. Let us now come to the categories of sampling techniques. Like I said, we will focus on probability and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling is randomized sampling, where each and every part of the population gets and has an equal chance of selection. Non-probability sampling is a kind of sampling where not every part of the population has an equal chance of getting selected for the study. Thereby, in probability sampling, say the first one that we are going to do in detail is the simple random sampling. Here, each and every part of the population has an equal chance of getting selected. So you cannot have any chance of bias in selecting any part of the population. So like we do the kind of picking the chit games, or having a ball out of the bags, or having playing the dice, and so on. Those are the kind of games or the kind of examples that we have for random sampling, random that is based on randomized sampling, which is based on probability sampling. Let us understand the simple random sampling. This uses randomization to make sure that every element of the population gets an equal chance to be part of the selected sample. It is alternatively known as random sampling, like I said. So here, let us say that I want to conduct a study. One prerequisite for conducting a simple random sampling is that I need to, I have no clue about the population that I'm going to conduct my study on. Because I am unknown to the population that I'm going to conduct my study on, so I cannot divide or categorize the population into different categories, and thereby the whole sample is equal to me and is random to me, unknown to me. Every part of the population is equal to me, and thereby every part of the population has got an equal chance of selection by me. But in order to have a fair chance, what I can do is give an equal number, allot an equal number to everyone, or give a chit to each and every one, and randomly, without looking at it, pick up chits from each and every part of the population and then select that part as my sample. So that becomes my sample. That will be a simple random sampling without being biased. And that is one of the most difficult part of simple random sampling. And as a researcher, for us, it becomes very difficult to utilize that as our methodology in sampling techniques when we are having a large population. So we have to be very careful when we say we are utilizing simple random sampling for getting our samples done. Next, we come to stratified sampling. For stratified sampling, I must be knowing about the population, and thereby what I do, I categorize the population into strata. So into certain categories, it can be anything, say gender, income, levels of education, and so on. So when I categorize the income category, the only part where I have to be careful is that the strata has to be homogeneous within itself, but within the strata, it has to, the strata within themselves have to be homogeneous, but two strata have to be heterogeneous. So, like I categorize gender and income. So, for gender, it has to be homogeneous. For income and between income and gender, it has to be heterogeneous. And thereby, using that part, I say that the whole population, it has to be stratified. I'm using stratified sampling technique to categorize my sample. But even within stratified sampling, I can have levels of stratified sampling techniques. Say, I can use single stratified sampling. I can have multiple stratified sampling. I can have levels of two level stratified sampling, and so on, based on the kind of selection that I will be doing at each level of strata. So this is an example of smaller population, how I am going to say put it into different strata, and from that strata, I am randomly then in the second stage pick up people from the group of people, which is the strata that I have categorized people into the population. Then we come to cluster sampling. Now, cluster sampling, and people generally get confused between stratified sampling and cluster sampling. But one basic difference between stratified sampling and cluster sampling is that in stratified sampling, we do not pick up the whole lot of the strata. We use only some part of the strata. We pick up some part of the strata, but in cluster, we generally use the whole cluster as our sample to use in the research. Even within cluster sampling, we have various levels of cluster sampling. We can have single level of cluster sampling. We can have two level of cluster sampling, and we can have multiple level of cluster sampling. So when a population is divided into, say, naturally occurring groups or cluster, the best example that I have used for cluster sampling, in fact, the best example that publicly is available also is for the Kerala migration report, which is available openly for as a public domain. And we are also using it for another migration project that we are working on. So in order to finalize the migrant population, say in Kerala, what we cannot estimate also, because the census has not happened for so many years, we cannot estimate the number of migrants that we have. In order to estimate the number of migrants, we would also need a baseline study. Now, as an ordinary researcher, like we said, like I already mentioned, we cannot take up a census study, but we can also take up a large scale study. For this, we can take up a cluster study. A cluster sampling study would then involve a very large sample, say a sample size of 50,000 household, which would be based on cluster sample of the migrants. Now, within this migrants also, we would then divide them based on the region, say regions which have highest rate of migration, out migration, in migration, and then also interstate migration, intrastate migration, international migration. So these are the broad categories into which we can divide and cluster this population of migrants. Thereby, within them, we have their clusters. After we get that cluster, we can then, as If we go for a single stage cluster sampling, if we have those clusters, we will have to take up whole of those clusters into our study. Now, if we go for a two-stage cluster sampling, then what do we do? For a single stage cluster sampling, what CDS has done, this is what it has done. Each unit of the chosen cluster is sampled completely. Each individual unit is the selected cluster. Now, here in the two-stage cluster sampling, we will take only only selected clusters as the sample. From the cluster also, some of the selected part will be taken, some of the selected sample will be taken as our sample from the cluster. First, we are dividing it into cluster. Then within the cluster, we are taking some part of the sample. So this becomes less representative than the single stage cluster sample, but then it also becomes less expensive than the first single stage cluster sampling. It also becomes less time taking than the single stage cluster sampling. In the multi-stage cluster sampling, what we can do, we keep on dividing it further and further. We come to such a point so that it cannot be divided until into a lower strata or a further subgroup. To the lowest strata or group, we divide it into smaller and smaller clusters, and then we pick up single unit of that sample, and that we make into our sample of the study. And that is how, and the final unit we are randomly selecting from the cluster. The cluster is based on the naturally occurring characteristic of the population, like I mentioned. But for the stages of the cluster sampling, we are then randomly selecting, and then we keep on selecting till we go to the last stage of that cluster, so that we cannot further divide it into the next cluster. And then the unit sample will be randomly selected, and that forms the final part of our sampling. And that is how we do multi-stage cluster sampling. That is much easier, less expensive, but it also is lesser accurate than single stage cluster sampling. We have covered for the randomized, which is the random sampling, probability sampling techniques. We in social sciences have started focusing, when we have lesser sample or lesser time to study, we focus more on non-probability sampling techniques. The probability sampling techniques, although are much more accurate in nature, they require more precision, more planning, and more time, more resources to plan and go ahead for accurately deciding the kind of sample and thereby conducting the research. But as ordinary researchers, when we conduct researches on personal level for research papers, for research projects which are of smaller size, or say projects which are lesser funded or which are required by us to be submitted in lesser time, we focus more on non-probability sampling, as that is more convenient and requires less time, less resources, and less planning to be employed. It does not rely on randomization. It relies more on researchers' ability to select elements for a sample. So, although you will find that in the kind of sampling techniques that you find in research papers published by good researchers, they employ non-probability sampling, but they are accepted because of the kind of experience that the researchers have. So the experience that a researcher has and the kind of ability that the researcher has a lot of importance when it comes to employing non-probability sampling for their research work. There is a huge possibility that the outcome of sampling, this kind of non-probability sampling, might be biased and makes difficult for all elements of population to be part of sample equally, of course, because it is not a sample, it is not a probability-based sampling, so it will not be possible for all parts of the population to be included in the sample. Thereby, this is known as non-random sampling, but this is also one of the most feasible sampling techniques for researchers. One of it is convenience sampling. Although personally it is not advisable to use convenience sampling, especially when you do researches in social sciences, because while doing or conducting surveys, the biases of the primary, while doing a primary survey, the bias of the respondents also matters a lot. Thereby, when you conduct a sampling, a survey, and you go by convenience sampling, it becomes difficult for you to defend your research work as an unbiased research work if you go with a convenience sampling. So personally, I would not advise to go for a convenience sampling, but sometimes it becomes inevitable to use a convenience sampling. Like you can see that one of the companies, very well known Lotterback company, which is an electronics company, and they employed convenience sampling for a study when they were selecting a sample of 5 mothers. Now, prenatal death, an experience of a prenatal death, is something that none would like to share. And this kind of data is something that you would not get readily available or publicly available on a public site or public domain. Thereby, convenience sampling is something that can be accepted by the researcher. So a convenience sampling may be used when the investigator is naturally forming a group, or it is difficult to get other kinds of informers or respondents for your research work, or the respondents who are not getting, or you're not getting respondents who are readily accepting to be part of your study. This also can be readily used in exploratory research, or when you have very limited time and resources available with you for your own research work. So this is an example of convenient sampling from your random people, from friends, from your known people, from your known resource people. This also one of the examples that we have taken recently while doing one of, well, here convenience sampling has really helped us. We are doing one of the World Bank projects right now, where we have been asked to conduct key informant interviews for Pune. Now, the key informant for Pune as a metropolitan region would be the stakeholders of Pune. Now, for stakeholders of Pune, they would include the government officials, the the people who are closely associated with the growth drivers of Pune, say the labor commissioner, say people who are involved, or the president of the Pune metropolitan region, the commissioner of Pune, or the labor commissioner, or say the workers, the construction workers. So these are key informant people, and we are taking key informant interviews, but for key informant interviews from them and using them in our report. We've been asked to do that, but they also are part when we ask of the kind of sampling technique that we are using. This also forms a part of convenience sampling, because these are also part of the people also that we know, or they are readily available to us. They are not only convenient sampling, but when we go further and we see, there is something called purposive sampling that also forms part of non-probability sampling. So when you purposely select someone for your study based on the goal and objectives of your study, and you reject the rest from your study, reject the rest of the respondents from your study, that also forms part of your sampling. So sometimes when readily available respondents are there, you can use convenience sampling for your study. Purposive sampling, like I was saying, purposive sampling is very, very useful for your research work as an independent researcher. It is a technique which is very, very commonly used in qualitative research specifically. It is information rich. It gives you very rich information from your respondents. You may have very limited number of respondents, but it will give you a lot of information. So the qualitative, if you are trying to do a qualitative work or qualitative research work, this kind of sampling is really going to help you. You select or identify individuals or a group of individuals which have that specific kind of knowledge or have an interest into that particular area. Say, like I was just mentioning, over here, if I want to write a research work on self-care, and there are people who have negative views on self-care, I would automatically reject them as my respondents for the study, because people who will have positive views and will give me positive replies and respond towards my study for self-care, I will include their perspective for the study that I am conducting. So, but for this method, I will have to be very careful in choosing my representative for the sample, because, and the individuals that I'm going to use for the sample, because that has to align with my goal and objective of the study. This has to be informative and has to be very specific, but also has to be very representative of the population that I have chosen for my study. This is purposely selecting the study. This is now another one is snowball sampling or referral sampling. So say I am conducting a study wherein I am like we conducted one of the studies. Okay, we did something which was working on sustainable menstrual products in Pune, in urban non-slum areas. Now, this is already a taboo topic, a topic that people do not like to discuss. So I just cannot go on talking to people and ask for their opinions. Even in urban areas, people do not like to engage in such topics. So what I would do is then ask someone who would like to engage in such a topic, then would ask that respondent to refer someone who would then fit my part of the study, because I would also be very specific that my part of the study requires this category. My category would be already fixed. The age category is fixed, the income category is fixed, the kind of population that I'm going to take into reference is already fixed. So within all of this area, what is the reference that my respondent is going to give me? Once my respondent gives me a reference within that framework, I will then go to that respondent and collect my data. Once I collect my data from that particular respondent will then give me reference of other respondent. And this is a very useful method of collecting data in social sciences, especially where the target population is difficult to reach and a topic where it is difficult to get feedback from, where people do not want to engage freely into a research or discussion. There it is very important as a sampling technique.
Yeah, ma'am. There is no short announcement. We are having 2 to 3 minutes to wind up.
Sure.
Then we are going to take question and answer session.
Sure. So I think I will, this is the last slide, quota sampling. So this is the last kind of sampling for non-probability sampling that we are dealing with today, is quota sampling. Now, why is it called quota sampling? Is because in this sampling, it is very similar to stratified sampling, but in stratified sampling, it is not divided into the kind of groups or strata that we had divided. It is based on the percentage or a ratio of the population size that the population is divided into. Say, there is a district, like I've given this example, I want to study the reading habits of high school students in a district. So this district has a high school population of 45 freshmen, 45 sophomores, that's high school students, for 20% of juniors, 10% of seniors. Now, in order to take a sample from them, I will have to create a sample size which will be equivalent to the representation of the percentage population of this same. So the proportion of the percentage of the population of 45% freshmen, 25% high school students, 25%, 20% juniors, and 10% seniors. If your final sample of 500 that you are studying doesn't include the exact ratio and proportion of the population, of the original population, it will not be a quota sampling and it will not justify the exact ratio of the sampling technique that you are using for your study. And thereby, quota sampling is extremely important where you want to do a study which is representative of its proportional sampling in your research methodology or your research work. It is very useful, especially in project works. So this is the kind of quota sampling. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Niharika Singh. It was indeed a very crystal clear as well as a very informative session for all our participants. I hope all our participants have benefited from your talk. As I was looking through the chat box, a few of our participants have already raised questions regarding the thing. So I would request the participants to one by one clarify your doubts regarding the same to Niharika ma'am. As you start, you can actually either paste your questions on the chat box, or you can directly raise your hands and ask the question to Niharika ma'am.
I encourage participants, those who have write down their questions in the chat box.
Okay.
It will be, very good if they will ask it directly, but they can unmute themselves, they can open their video. If they are not
Yes.
in a position to open their videos, at least they open their mic if they are, able, ask directly the question. That would be, really great to make the session interactive.
Mm.
Unless if they are unable to do it, then we can, read from the chat.
Yes. Yes.
Dr.
Please introduce
Niharika.
yourself and explain your question to the researchers.
I am engaged in the research
This is Dr.
Department
Vidhu
of Commerce
from
School
Punjab.
of Economics.
Okay, over to you, Dr. Vidhu, and after that we can have your question, Dr. Yogesh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Niharika, when I was listening to your well-explained presentation, I had one doubt that whenever we are going through various research papers where the sample is presented as 750 or 320, I just want to understand or know from you what would be the adequate size of the sample if the population is more than 1,000 or say 2,000. Because there has to be some representative sample to kindly throw some light on that part as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Vidhu. What we generally do to understand the sample size is, although a 10% population is an ideal representation of the sample, a 10% sample is ideal representation of the population. But when the sample size is very large or there is an unknown size of the population, it is given through research methodology that 365 is the minimum sample size, which is adequate also to represent any kind of population, to give a kind of output that would be representative for the results for that population. So 365 we generally take as a minimum representative size of the sample for any kind of unknown population.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Over to you, Dr. Yogesh.
Thank you. Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Ma'am, could you please discuss the sampling error and the exploratory sampling technique?
Sorry, sampling error and?
Exploratory sampling technique.
Okay, exploratory. So exploratory sampling, it's actually exploratory research design. So exploratory research design is used in areas where we want to come up with new ideas. Descriptive is something that we have already, that there is an already established fact, and we are coming up, we are trying to come up with, say, a new feature of an already existing concept. But exploratory is a completely new ideology, and we are trying to establish a completely new concept. Say you come up with a new theory, even that comes into an exploratory ideology. A completely unexplored concept or a theory or a theoretical framework that has not come up now, that has not been experimented, that has not been explored till now, that all comes under the exploratory research design, which has not been established as a fact till now. And that is why we make sure that the exploratory research design is flexible enough to understand various different perspectives, and we use experienced persons and already existing literature or various kinds of cross-referencing to understand the new ideas for these kind of exploratory research design.
Let us take question from Muhammad Ali. Is there? He has raised the hand.
Ali has raised hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singh. Very, very interesting and fruitful talk. I have a question also regarding the sample size. as you mentioned in your first answer to the question,
Mhm.
that 365 is the minimum. So I'm seeing it as minimum 365 and maximum total population.
Right.
How do we go in between? So, for example, I find it troubling sometimes to understand in multiple indicator cluster surveys, for even for one province of Pakistan, they go up to 44,000 observations, and in demographic and health surveys, they go to 11,000 for the entire country. So how do we determine this sample size in the middle? Of course, the budget has to be one of the reasons, but how do we actually make sure that the population is representative of the rural, urban, province, and so on? So if you could shed some light on it. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Professor. So, like you already said, that budget is an extremely important part of such kind of projects because one, timeline, second, budget. When we are trying to find out, say, the consumption expenditure of whole of a province or a country, so that we cannot limit ourselves to 365 sample and say that this is representation of the whole population. For that, we will have to then take at least 5 to 10% of the whole population and say that this is representation of the population and we can go ahead with it. But we also have to take into account a household rather than an individual for the sampling. So here also we have to then take into account whether we are taking an individual for our sampling or an household, because when we take household for our sampling, the individual sampling will increase by threefold given the kind of household size. So the average household size, say if it is 4.5, it increases by 4.5 fold. So that is a very important constraint, Professor. And we generally then go by a very, it might sound very weird, but we go by 5% to 10%. And we also keep it very open and random based on our budget. Such huge samples, because for the present that we are doing, and the biggest migration survey that has happened, especially in India, for Kerala migration survey, it was based on not the representative population, but also the budget constraint and the time constraint. So the 56,000 households that we are talking about, or the 50,000 households that we're talking about, we are basing it on a representation of the population, of the migrant population, not of the state population. So there are a lot of factors that we take into consideration when we talk of deciding the sample size, but generally we consider 5 to 10% of the population size.
I hope it was clear. Now over to you, Atif Ahmed.
Yes, hello, ma'am. Hello, everyone. So my question is, how do we maximize the efficacy of sampling where there is behavioral bias of the respondents? For example, migrants asked about the conditions where they have migrated to. Sometimes migrants may be hesitant because of the repercussions they may face after the responses, like the social security and these kind of things. So how do we maximize the efficacy in these conditions, in these samplings where there is a behavioral bias in the respondents or the responses?
So that is a very common feature in social sciences, especially in behavioral kind of or qualitative kind of studies in social sciences. This completely depends on the expertise of the resource person or the person who collects the sample. And that is why it is extremely tricky and requires a lot of experience and training before going in the field to collect primary data. Before going to the field, we need a lot of training, how to ask questions, how to make the respondent comfortable. So the kind of pre-questioning which makes the respondents comfortable so that the respondents will answer your questions which are extremely personal is very important for the questioner to understand. So the researcher has to understand the intricacies of these points where the the researcher has to first make the respondent comfortable. Only then the respondent or the migrant will give you proper answers. Otherwise, they will not be open to you. So it is very tricky, requires a lot of training and experience.
So do we use snowball in it, or any
You
other?
can use snowball in it. And what we generally do for migrant data collection is that we go to, there's something called a labor mandi. There are clusters of laborers gathered together, and we go to their contractors, we talk to them together. They collect the data in the groups. The groups of laborers are available there, and we talk to them, take down the data together, and then through the contractors only, we get the rest of the interviews. So that's how we collect the data from the migrant laborers.
Thank you. And one last request. So how can we connect with you after the workshop? Because I am doing some stories on migration as of now. So I wanted to
Sure,
have
sure.
some
My
inputs.
email ID will be there. I'll share it with you, and then you can email me after this for the same.
Thank you.
Sure. You can also look at the Symbiosis School of Economics website for my email ID.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions?
Hello.
Yes, Jaskaran Singh ji.
Yes. First of all, I applaud the way the madam is responding to the queries. And my query is that, Dr. Niharika, what is the basis that you have told that the accurate sampling may be 365, as you have mentioned? Like now we have two types of data, that one is probability and second is non-probability. Sometimes we can have only a sample size of like 30, 20, like when we are doing qualitative research. And sometimes that population is too large that even the 365 might be a lesser number. And then I want to know the source, that if you can please. Thank you.
Sure, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the basis on which I said, there are two things. One, the statistical methodology books that we have all, I think all of us have studied for unknown large population size. When we calculate it accordingly to the statistical methodology, n is equals to n plus and so on. According very correct. For a large population, 365 is a very minimal, and thereby I said that even 365 is not enough at times, and 5% to 10% is the kind of representative population that we generally take if we have the kind of budget or the time for the research that we are undertaking. Second, for qualitative research work, sometimes that I said for the unknown population for a quantitative research methodology. For a qualitative research methodology, at times 5 in-depth interviews, 5 to 10 in-depth interviews of 1 to 2 hours each is also enough to explain a certain phenomena. I myself and my colleague has undertaken such a qualitative research work to explain the concepts related to qualitative research work. So I completely agree with you. 365 is just a number by research methodology book that I mentioned over here that we take when we do not have any idea of the population.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks.
Over to you, ma'am. Yes, Ms. Fernandez.
Thank you.
I think she is not having question now. You can, direct the chat box. If somebody is interested
I think
to,
Mr. Raghav Dev Murari has a question. If he is available online, could you please explain the question? Or Mr. Raghav Dev Murari? No. Okay. Then I'll just I'll just read the question. Considering a situation where the population itself is smaller, like a very rare disease infecting 2,000 people, while encountering these types of situations, should we still take out a sample or should we consider the whole population for the study? because he says that there are some constraints like costing or geographical problem arising, taking the whole population for study. So what should be done in such a particular situation is his question.
Okay, so 2000 is the population size. But if he doesn't have a, a money constraint and time constraint, then that 2000 can be his sample size. So thereby the whole universe, because that is his population size, so the whole population can be part of his study and he does not need to take out his sample. Like I said, that if the whole universe in itself is smaller, then the whole universe can be considered as the population for the study. So if both are not constraints, then he can consider the whole as part of the study.
But he has, created this hypothetical condition. He is giving example of that there might be 2000 infected, people. And in that case, should we need, sampling? Again, I want to add some point here. Again, it demands that what type of study we are going to do. For example, cancer patient is having certain type of symptoms, as he has mentioned that infecting 2000 population.
Right.
So
Right.
from belonging to any country or belonging to any state, that time particular sample will can help us to examine what are the problems by studying particular 3, 4, or 100 samples. Just like in COVID-19, how they have developed their
Right.
vaccine. But it depends upon the what type of study we are going to conduct and what are the objectives. But in social science, we're doing socio-economic studies, then 2000 is outside here. So these are my few points.
Thank you.
Next question. There is
There is one more question from Harjit Kaur. The question is, how can we decide sample size which will fully represent the population? Is there any particular method to choose the sample size?
Yes, there are a lot of methods depending on the kind of population. So there is a book of statistics that we have to refer to, as in you can refer any book of statistics, where there are specific formulae to understand for known population, for unknown population, for partially known population. There are various, if you go by formula, for exact number, there are formula to decide and understand the exact representation of number of sample from the population.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. Is
Thank
there
you.
any more questions?
as of now, there is
If there are no more questions, so we will move to our next session because we are already running out of time.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So yes, so on behalf of Jammu Kashmir Economic Association and the School of Commerce and Management, Linkayat Vidyapeeth, I would like to thank our resource person for today, Dr. Niharika Singh, for elaborately explaining the sampling techniques, and wish you all the best. And over to you. So.
Thank you, Dr. Niharika Singh, for your insightful session on sample techniques and research. The knowledge and insights you share with us have significantly enhanced our understanding and will undoubtedly be beneficial in our research journey. Thank you once again for taking time to share your expertise with us. And also, we are very thankful to Dr. Nabila for moderating the session very effectively. Thank you so much, ma'am. Both of you, thank you.